By the 1,840 Limestone County lived by the rhythm of the Tennessee River. Cotton ginned inland, drifted down on flatboats like white weatherfront, meeting factors in New Orleans who translated bales into banknotes and reputations. On warm nights, the water breathed against the pilings and the families on the bluffs pretended the sound was prosperity itself, constant, reliable, unthreatening. It was a useful fiction. Under the linen of polite visits and the measured talk at agricultural society meetings, ledger ink told a more nervous story. Notes coming due, wagers poorly kept, rain arriving either all at once or not at all. The river carried profit, but it also carried news. 3 households dominated the county's eastern townships, their names spoken with the practiced deference of people who understood how quickly fortunes could reverse. At Fairmont, a 2,400-acre spread cleaved from hardwood bottomland, the Rutledges held court. Samuel Rutledge arrived from South Carolina in 1838 with the assurance of inherited capital, kept 87 enslaved laborers, and a study full of correspondence, some congratulatory, some implacably collectible. His wife, Catherine, was Virginian by upbringing and by manner, precise in her tastes, a woman who arranged flowers as if they were arguments. They had 3 children, 2 sons following the predictable path of distant universities, and Lydia, 19, the age when neighboring planters' sons began to ask careful questions about afternoon calls and chaperones. 5 miles upriver, Riverside looked newer, more deliberate, the kind of place built by a man who expected visitors and the record they would keep. James Halfhill, 43, county magistrate with the posture of a man between cases, had married Margaret, 10 years younger, in a union communicated as much in newspaper announcements as in family Bibles. 4 children completed their polished picture, yet even in that house the servants heard his voice drop when certain names appeared in letters and saw him fold paper too quickly when footsteps approached. At Oak Ridge, set back from the river and posted with practical fences rather than ornamental hedges, Daniel Crenshaw ran 1,800 acres, as if profit were a moral duty. A widower of 51, he was not the sort to be charmed by silver or French. He balanced accounts in the mornings and walked the rows in the evenings, and rarely confused ornament with value. His 3 children were grown, their competence a kind of household creed. Oak Ridge did not host musicales. It hosted harvests. If you had asked any of these men in the spring of 1847 to name the threat that would undo them, they would have pointed to weather, weevils, markets, or to the other men in the room. None would have named a woman listed as property on a mobile auction sheet. Yet it was there, in humid air that smelled of rope and tallow, that the beginning of their ruin was quietly catalogued. Samuel's trip to Mobile that April was unremarkable in intention. The river made travel practical, and collections were easier in person than by letter when debtors' politeness ran ahead of their coin. He stepped into the estate sale mostly to pass an hour and to see who else had come. 37 enslaved people were being liquidated. Field hands, a blacksmith, 2 seamstresses, a boy with quick hands who was prematurely priced like a man. The auctioneer's patter washed over the room, practiced and indifferent. Prices climbed and fell in a way that told those listening what the last season had done to their neighbors. Then the unusual listing, Rachel, approximately 24, house-trained, literate, accomplished in needlework and music, fluent in French and English. The line that followed drew several raised brows and a few sidelong glances. Sale by special decree. Purchaser must ensure removal at least 100 miles from Mobile. She was tall, the sheet said, and light brown, which in such rooms meant something different to every bidder. The number the auctioneer called next did not match the description. $400, a fraction of the $1,200 that skilled house servants could command if their references were fashionable enough. Men who understood the arithmetic of human property felt the figures snag. There are discounts, and then there are warnings written in numerals. Samuel told himself he was not a sentimental buyer. He could recite what a daughter needed to be taught before she was presented, and he could estimate the value of an accomplished French-speaking house servant against the awkwardness of Lydia's accent when she tried to imitate Catherine's visiting Richmond cousins. He could observe that Catherine's confidence grew noticeably when a competent woman handled the parlor and the pantry, and that confidence too, had a market value in a county where wives arranged alliances as neatly as sideboards. 1,000 small calculations assembled themselves into a decision he would later call practical. He asked the auction agent about the removal stipulation. "Estate technicality," the man replied with the smile that appears only when a sale is close. "A family matter, nothing to concern a gentleman purchasing for the Huntsville district." He said this lightly, as if the law were a dusting that could be brushed from a sleeve. He did not say why the decree existed, or who had asked the judge to write it, or whether paper can ever contain a pattern. Samuel, who could be meticulous about barley feed weights and careless about clauses, nodded. The bid went through. On the road back north, Samuel arranged transport and the fiction of inevitability. The purchase had solved several problems at once. Catherine would have both example and assistant in her march toward gentility's higher ground. Lydia would have a teacher whose French did not collapse under scrutiny. The household would have a new axis around which tasks could turn without his attention. He allowed himself to imagine the relief of things quietly handled by someone else. It took 3 weeks to move her upriver, days of heat and river stink, and cypress receding into the study windows of plantations that envisioned themselves as England's grandchildren. Men on wharves did not look at her face if they could help it. Women did, and thought about what it would mean to have someone like that pass through their parlors without any of the protections that attended a guest. Information moves in rooms like those, and not all of it in words. When the wagon finally turned up Fairmont's Lane, the live oaks tried their old trick of making shade look like safety. Catherine, who distrusted both surprises and disorder, appraised the new arrival with a cool authority that had sent lesser servants to the cookhouse. She found little to rebuke. The woman's posture suggested training. Her dress plain, clean, mended where a seamstress would notice suggested someone who understood how to be present without taking space. "Rachel," Catherine said, as if testing the name for defects, and the answer came in a French so even that Catherine permitted herself a small private satisfaction. In that household, correctness had a temperature, and it warmed the room. The first days passed in the way good servants make them pass silently, swiftly, without leaving fingerprints on the silver. There were lessons for Lydia, whose quickness had been looking for a worthy shape, and parlor tasks for afternoons when visitors came. Rachel learned the notes of Catherine's impatience, the hour when Samuel's account soured his mood, the sound Lydia made when flattery was working too well, the way the kitchen went quiet when the ledger's leather creaked open in the study. Nothing about this was unusual. A skilled house servant survives by seeing what others miss. But there are ways of seeing that are more than survival. What did draw comment softly at first, then with the comfort of repetition, was the price. In a county where men measured one another with figures before they used adjectives, the amount could not help but be spoken. A bargain, some said, to congratulate Samuel by the rules of their club. Odd, others said, meaning the same thing but thinking about decrees and distances. The line on the bill of sale about 100 miles recurred in conversation like a tune people could not place. It would have been easier to ignore if she had been clumsy, or dull, or sullen. It is such people who explain a discount. But a woman who moved through a room like that, tidy, exact, unbothered by the scrutiny of women who loved to find fault, forced a different hypothesis, that the price had not measured the item at all, but the seller's appetite to be rid of it. Meanwhile, the river kept moving, and so did the county's business notes renewed, partnerships proposed in voices that pretended they were favors. The 3 households performed their separate rituals. Catherine's mornings of instruction and arrangement, Havehill's careful appearances in town, Crenshaw's dusk walks through rows arranged like equations. No one yet thought to look for connections that did not pass through a cotton press or a courthouse. The great machinery of the place clicked forward with the confidence of habit. But habit is not fate. Patterns designed to make one group of people visible and another group invisible can be studied and used by anyone patient enough to count their revolutions. Before the summer heat fully settled, the map of Limestone County's power, who owed whom, who drank too much, who gambled, who kept letters in which drawer had begun to redraw itself inside one woman's mind. She had not yet acted, she had only watched. Often, that is where destruction begins, not with a strike, but with a gaze. On a Sunday evening in late May, after visitors had gone and Lydia's embroidery lay folded like a promise, Catherine set down her teacup and allowed herself a rare contentment. The house felt orderly, the daughter improved. The husband, placid. She could not know that somewhere in the accounting of that serenity was a price someone else had already decided to pay. Nor could she know that a line inked in Mobile, removal not less than 100 miles, was less a precaution than a prophecy. The river exhaled. Fireflies stitched their brief signatures in the dark. In the study, a ledger cooled beneath Samuel's hand, a column of small debts, adding to a sum he intended to master. Upstairs, Lydia's candle burned later than it should, bright enough to catch the eye of anyone who had chosen to watch. And in the back rooms, where the night held different conversations, Rachel listened the way a cartographer listens before drawing a map, collecting names, distances, and the slightest tilt in a voice that says where the ground is soft. The summer of 1847 began without omen. In Limestone County, June heat rose early and stayed heavy. Evenings that should have offered relief came instead with thunder that never quite arrived. Inside Fairmont's long verandas, the air was thick enough to make conversation sluggish. Only one person in that house seemed untouched by it, Rachel. Her presence changed the tempo of the household in ways too subtle to notice until the difference became habit. Mornings began with her soft knock at Catherine's door. Water poured into the porcelain basin, linens folded into perfect symmetry, fresh flowers placed without the clumsy fragrance of inexperience. Catherine, accustomed to sighing through servants' small incompetencies, found herself silent. When Rachel entered a room, she did so as if the room belonged to her order of things, not the other way around. Within a week, she understood the household's pulse, which servant carried gossip, which child's laughter soothed Catherine's migraines, when Samuel returned from the study needing a careful silence before conversation. These were not mysteries to anyone observant, but Rachel's observance had precision that unsettled those who worked beside her. The first assignment Catherine gave her was to refine Lydia's accomplishments. The daughter had beauty of the kind that draws comment and concern in equal measure, soft features, ungoverned curiosity, and a manner of speaking that often ran ahead of discretion. Rachel began lessons with French conversation, but the sound of her voice changed the air. She spoke with the polished rhythm of a woman educated, not trained, and when Lydia stumbled, she corrected with such gentle certainty that even Catherine, listening from the parlor, felt admiration layered with unease. Every afternoon they sat by the tall windows, embroidery frames between them, Rachel reciting phrases about Parisian manners and letters of invitation. Lydia laughed often. Catherine, hearing it, began to believe the purchase a triumph. She did not see that behind the pleasant repetitions of words like times bonjour times and times mademoiselle times was a quiet evaluation. Rachel measuring Lydia's mind as she had measured Catherine's patience. Samuel watched these changes with relief. For the first time in months, his wife and daughter seemed occupied without complaint. He told himself that efficiency was always worth its price, even when its source felt oddly opaque. At supper, he sometimes caught Rachel's glance, not impertinent, not shy, but direct enough that he found himself wondering how much servants should understand of a master's affairs. He dismissed the thought as foolish self-consciousness. By July, Fairmont's daily life moved to rhythms Rachel had set. Ledgers balanced more neatly, letters went out on time, and guests praised the household's new grace. Beneath that order, invisible eddies formed. Lydia spent longer hours with Rachel, long enough that conversations trailed off when others entered. In those pauses lay the first signs of uneasy servants exchanging looks. A cook, crossing herself when Rachel passed, murmured prayers at nightfall. No one accused, no one could. Rachel's conduct remained flawless, but she asked questions, not the kind that seem bold when spoken aloud, but the quiet ones that slip into talk unnoticed. How do they decide cotton prices this year? Does Mr. Haverhill still serve as magistrate? Which families keep daughters at home, and which send them to Mobile for schooling? Each query, on its own, an idle curiosity, together, a survey. Sometimes she lingered in the hall outside Samuel's study under the pretext of delivering correspondence. She noticed which papers he folded with care, which he left open too long. In time, she learned to read the rhythm of his pen across the page, rapid when calculating profits, slower, almost tremulous when rewriting debts. By midsummer, she knew what the family itself would not admit. Fairmont was prosperous only by reputation. Samuel's cotton fields had suffered 2 bad seasons, and his gambling debts in Huntsville had begun to darken the pages of his ledgers. Catherine's refinement masked a tightening household budget. Lydia's potential engagement prospects had as much to do with rescuing accounts as with affection. Rachel never mentioned what she knew. Knowledge kept silent becomes leverage. On July 14th, Samuel sat in his study, windows half shuttered against the glare. He was calculating figures that refused to resolve, the kind that end with the taste of iron in the mouth. Rachel entered quietly, setting a cup of coffee on the desk. He nodded distractedly, muttering about unpaid notes from the Haverhill firm. She paused, the faintest hesitation. "Sir, if I may be so bold," she said, voice level as a ledger. "When I lived in Mobile, I served in a house that dealt often with the Haverhill family's business. There are matters concerning their finances that you might wish to know." He looked up sharply. Few people in Limestone County spoke of another man's affairs without calculation, yet the composure in Rachel's face disarmed him. "What matters?" She took the offered chair and began with the calm precision of someone enumerating supplies. Havehill's failed land speculations, uncollected debts, questionable partners. Dates, figures, names, each detail verifiable, none exaggerated. Samuel's skepticism dissolved into fascination. For the first time, he saw a path through his difficulties, knowledge as weapon, discretion as shield. When she rose to leave, he said, "You'll speak of this to no one." "Of course not, sir," Rachel replied. "It would serve neither of us." The phrase should have troubled him us times, but instead it comforted. He was not alone in his struggle. Someone understood. That night a storm broke over Fairmont, lightning splitting the oak near the veranda, thunder rolling through the valley like artillery. Lydia woke crying. Catherine prayed. Samuel lay awake, thinking of Haverhill and the information he now possessed. In another room, Rachel listened to the rain with eyes open. Storms rarely frighten those who know how to call them. The next morning, Samuel wrote to request a meeting with James Haverhill to discuss mutual interests. Catherine, reading over his shoulder, found the phrase dull and mercantile. She could not have guessed its purpose, to blackmail respectability into solvency. When he left for Riverside, the river mist followed him like a shroud. He carried inside his pocket a small sheet on which Rachel had written 2 names, both of which she said might persuade Haverhill to be cooperative. Her handwriting was delicate, the letters evenly spaced. Samuel noticed this only once years later, when those same letters appeared in a different document, copied by another hand, and the full pattern finally showed itself. But in 1847, he rode away satisfied, believing himself clever and fortunate. Behind him, Rachel resumed her duties with quiet precision. She polished the silver until her reflection appeared, then looked at it long enough to see not a servant, but an architect, drafting blueprints invisible to everyone else in the house. Within days, word spread that Rutland and Haverhill had reached an arrangement. To neighbors, it looked like ordinary commerce. To Rachel, it was the first line drawn on a map of ruin she intended to finish. Meanwhile, Lydia grew restless. Rachel's lessons had shifted again. Now she spoke less about French verbs and more about French ideas, how women there could inherit property, how intellect could be a form of freedom. Lydia repeated these phrases in her journal, unsure why they thrilled and frightened her at once. "Rachel says our society is built on a game men play with money," she wrote one night. "I think she may be right." Catherine saw only that her daughter was distracted and reprimanded her gently for neglecting her embroidery. Lydia returned to her frame and stitched the words Times Liberté asterisk and Times Destined Times into the corner of the linen, hidden where no one would see. By late July, Fairmont's calm had acquired a fragile sheen. Catherine believed her household finally respectable. Samuel believed himself rescued. Lydia believed freedom was possible. Only Rachel understood that belief, properly cultivated, can become the most efficient kind of weapon. When the sun set on that month, the cicadas screamed loud enough to drown the sound of distant thunder. Rachel closed the shutters, extinguished the lamp, and smiled, not in triumph, not yet, but in recognition. Every system contains its weaknesses. One need only live inside it long enough to hear where it creaks. By August, Rachel had become an invisible fixture at Fairmont. Her silence made people careless. In every southern household of status, the enslaved were trained to move without sound and speak without consequence. It was a comfort the Rutledges had grown to depend upon the illusion that silence meant ignorance. But silence, in Rachel's hands, was observation distilled into weaponry. The household trusted her completely now. Catherine called her "times my treasure**, a phrase she used only for servants she believed incapable of independent thought. Samuel referred to her as "that clever woman," meaning it as praise that cost him nothing. Lydia, however, no longer used the word servant at all. By day, Rachel served tea, arranged flowers, and supervised the maids. By night, she wrote. In her small room off the kitchen, she kept a single ledger, a mirror to Samuel's own. Inside, written in steady script, were notes about everything she had seen and heard: debts, flirtations, diseases, alliances. She mapped the county through whispers carried by men who believed gossip beneath their dignity. News traveled along invisible arteries. Field hands at neighboring plantations shared rumors at the river docks. Peddlers repeated them on back roads. Rachel asked few questions, only enough to appear interested, never enough to alarm. But she listened. One mention of a late payment here, a rumor of a mistress there, and she drew invisible lines connecting Fairmont, Riverside, and Oak Ridge. In 6 weeks, she knew more about Limestone County's private economy than its magistrates. Every evening she returned to her duties in Catherine's parlor, listening as the lady of the house recited invitations and fretted about social precedents. Catherine thought herself safe discussing such matters in front of Rachel. After all, what could a servant do with knowledge of who sat where at dinner? She did not realize that to Rachel, seating charts revealed hierarchies, debts, and alliances, maps of affection as clear as any topographical survey. Samuel's scheme against Haverhill was already in motion. Rachel had supplied him with details about land speculations gone wrong, just enough truth to make insinuation feel like revelation. On July 22nd, he paid his visit to Riverside. The exchange between the two men was cordial in tone, venomous in substance. Samuel spoke of concerns, of mutual protection of interests. Haverhill understood the language immediately, extortion phrased as neighborly concern. By the time Samuel returned home, the partnership had been struck, Haverhill's money shoring up Samuel's debts in exchange for Rutledge's political endorsement. To Samuel it felt like victory. To Rachel, it was the opening act of collapse. That night, she received Samuel's thanks with modest composure. "I only told you what I happened to know, sir," she said, but inside, she marked the success carefully. One family compromised, another indebted, and a third, the Crenshaws, about to be drawn into the same web through Lydia. Bess, the cook, began to watch her uneasily. In the quarters, she whispered warnings. "That woman's eyes don't rest. I seen them kind before. My cousin down in Mobile told me about one looked gentle, talked soft, but families broke apart after she came." The others laughed, saying Bess saw ghosts in candle smoke, but fear has a way of sticking even when mocked. Lydia's attachment deepened. She spent hours in Rachel's room, reading poems copied in French, confiding in her about her loneliness and the weight of her parents' expectations. Rachel listened with patience that felt like affection. Then, in moments chosen with surgical precision, she planted questions. "Do you ever wonder why women must be bartered like fields? Do you believe freedom of the mind exists for people like us?" At first, Lydia only blushed and laughed. Then she began to write. Her journal, once filled with verses about flowers and rain, grew darker. Entries about souls in cages, the cruelty of inheritance, the beauty of rebellion. Rachel encouraged this transformation with care. She knew that the most effective rebellion is the one a person believes their own idea. Meanwhile, Samuel's arrangement with Haverhill began to sour. Rumors spread that Haverhill regretted his investment. No one could say who had mentioned that Samuel's gambling debts were worse than known. Neighbors speculated that Haverhill had been tricked. The whisper reached Catherine through a visitor from Huntsville. That evening she asked her husband directly, and his defensive tone told her the truth. From her corner of the room, Rachel observed the exchange, Catherine's hurt, Samuel's anger, the widening silence between them. Every raised voice confirmed her calculations. By September, the plantation had become an orchestra of tension, each player out of tune, each waiting for the other to begin the discord. On September 6th, Rachel approached Samuel again, claiming concern. "Mr. Haverhill has spoken in town of your debts. she said softly. "He fears you intend to burden him. He seeks to ruin you, sir." Samuel's temper flared exactly as she expected. Within hours, he rode to the Agricultural Society meeting and publicly accused Haverhill of slander. The two men quarreled before half the county's gentry. The spectacle drew whispers louder than any debt ledger could record. Rachel had achieved what she needed: open hostility between two of the region's most powerful men. Catherine, mortified, confined herself indoors. Lydia, unsettled, confided in Rachel more than ever. "My father says everything is ruined," she wept. Rachel consoled her with quiet words about courage and independence. "Sometimes," she told her, "a woman must choose truth over obedience." Within weeks, Lydia disappeared. She left behind a single note, written in a hand Catherine could barely recognize. Asterisk, "I will not be traded as debt payment. I will live as my own person." Asterisk. The language was elegant, foreign to Lydia's usual tone. Catherine fainted upon reading it. Samuel's fury turned the house into a court of inquisition. Servants were interrogated, beaten, confined. Rachel, feigning grief, wept convincingly under questioning. Miss Lydia never spoke of leaving, she insisted, eyes lowered. She was unhappy. "Yes, but I thought it only girlish temper." The search stretched for 3 weeks. Newspapers carried notices offering reward for information. Neighbors whispered of seduction, abduction, or madness. None guessed the truth, that Lydia had not fled alone. Rachel's network, the same messengers who traded cotton prices and personal gossip, had guided the girl north through the clandestine routes of free black communities. Lydia believed herself emancipated. In reality, she was a pawn removed from the board, precisely when her family's scandal required distraction. At Fairmont, grief and ruin completed their work. Samuel's business collapsed under the strain of public humiliation. Catherine's health failed. Bess, standing in the kitchen doorway as Rachel packed her few possessions, whispered, "That woman brings death with her." She was right. In late September, Daniel Crenshaw visited Fairmont on routine business. He found Samuel pale, nervous, desperate for money to fund the ongoing search. Rachel was there, overseeing the household with eerie composure. She spoke to Crenshaw only once, thanking him for his kindness to the Ruttled family, her voice measured, eyes unflinching. Something in her bearing caught his attention. Oak Ridge lacked a woman's management. His own daughter's efficiency had grown brittle with care. When he left Fairmont, the idea followed him home like a tune he could not forget. 2 days later, Crenshaw sent an offer. $900 for Rachel's purchase, more than double her original price. Samuel agreed without hesitation. Rachel was transferred on October 3rd, 1847. Behind her, she left an estate gutted of wealth and reputation, a wife bedridden, and a daughter vanished into myth. She did not look back. As the wagon carried her toward Oak Ridge, the last light of the season bled across the fields, turning cotton white as bone. Somewhere behind her, thunder rolled again, and the cracked oak at Fairmont's gate groaned in the wind like something remembering pain. Ahead lay new ground to study, new weaknesses to map, and new names to write in her ledger. Rachel adjusted her shawl against the chill, the faintest smile on her lips. The pattern had repeated once more. 2 families down. 1 remained. Oak Ridge stood apart from the river, its rows of cotton tapering toward a line of pines that whispered even when the air was still. Daniel Crenshaw liked it that way. Distance meant control. He had built his fortune on predictable harvests and a belief that discipline, not luck, governed success. When Rachel arrived in October 1847, he greeted her without ceremony, more curious about the ledger of her previous service than the woman herself. A literate servant, he reasoned, might ease the paperwork that Margaret, his eldest, handled with competent but uninspired precision. Rachel studied the house the way an engineer studies a bridge, by testing where it bore weight. Everything at Oak Ridge functioned with austere efficiency, meals punctual, accounts balanced, worship observed. There were no languid afternoons of music, no parlor chatter. To Catherine Rutledge's mind, such a household would have seemed joyless. To Rachel, it looked like a mechanism waiting to be recalibrated. She understood almost immediately that Daniel Crenshaw's vanity was not in manners but in reason. He prized numbers, production, and the illusion that profit proved moral worth. So she adapted. The refinement that had charmed the Rutledges became restraint. The The musical French accent softened into the crisp diction of a clerk. Within days, she began reorganizing supply records, tracing inconsistencies in feed accounts, and pointing out small inefficiencies that saved dollars. Daniel noticed. He began to seek her opinion on matters of crop rotation and credit, surprised to find her answers sharper than those of the overseer. He paid 3 times her market value. Margaret Crenshaw did not share her father's admiration. At 23, she had managed the household since her mother's death, and the arrival of this tall, self-possessed woman threatened the fragile order she had built. "She knows too much," Margaret told her brother William. Her eyes moved like someone taking inventory. William laughed, but uneasily. He had seen those eyes too. They did not blink when a man expected them to. Through November, the rhythm of Oakridge shifted almost imperceptibly. Daniel spent longer hours in the study with Rachel, reviewing figures by lamplight. Margaret ate supper alone more often. The enslaved community, watching from a cautious distance, whispered of another Fairmont in the making. They had heard the stories: the missing daughter, the cracked oak tree, the master drinking alone in a darkened house. Rachel noticed everything. She saw the debt notes Daniel kept hidden behind a false panel in his desk. She recognized the pattern. Small borrowings repeated with increasing frequency, the mark of a man gambling on tomorrow's prices. By December, she had pieced together the secret her employer could not admit, even to himself. He was financing a massive land purchase with money he did not possess. One poor season, one fall in cotton prices, and Oakridge would follow Fairmont into ruin. Yet she did not act immediately. Patience had always been her sharpest blade. Daniel Crenshaw was not ruled by vanity or lust. He could not be undone by flattery or temptation. His weakness was the same pride he mistook for logic. To destroy him, she would need allies he could neither see nor understand. Those allies took form through the same channels she had once used at Fairmont: enslaved workers who moved between plantations, carrying news like pollen. They told her which merchants extended credit, which factors pressed for payment, which families Daniel hoped to impress. They spoke also of a magistrate's misfortunes, the collapse of James Havhill's partnership, and the whispers that he blamed both Rutland and Crenshaw for his losses. Rachel listened without expression, but when she returned to her room that night, she added a new column to her ledger: asterisk connections between households. Asterisk. By January 1848, fortune presented the missing piece. Havhill, desperate for capital, rode to Oakridge, proposing a cotton factoring partnership. Rachel served coffee during his visit, invisible as always, and heard every word. Havhill offered favorable terms. Daniel hesitated, tempted yet cautious. When the men adjourned, Rachel waited until evening and then spoke in the tone of a servant whose loyalty outweighed her place. "Sir, I beg pardon if I presume," she said quietly, "but when I was at Fairmont I saw what such partnerships can do. Mr. Havhill ruined Mr. Rutland with false dealings. His name is whispered in Mobile as one who entangles honest men." Every sentence inverted the story she had once told. The lie fit so neatly into Daniel's prejudice that he thanked her for it. Within days he rejected Havhill's offer, convinced his prudence had saved him. Rachel had achieved her first objective: suspicion between the county's 2 remaining powers. Now she needed chaos within Oakridge itself. She found it in William Crenshaw, the middle child, handsome, earnest, and hiding a dangerous secret. Through her network she learned he had married a shopkeeper's daughter, Anna Pritchard, in Athens, and that the girl was expecting a child. Such a union, if known, would disgrace Daniel and shatter the family's claim to gentility. Rachel waited until February, when the household slept under a rare frost, and arranged for Daniel to accidentally discover one of Anna's letters left among William's papers. The explosion was immediate. Daniel's fury filled the house like smoke. He confronted his son, who refused to repent, and revealed the marriage was already legal. Daniel disinherited him that night and ordered him from the estate before dawn. Margaret tried to intervene. Samuel, the youngest, stood pale and silent as William rode away. Rachel, watching from the stairwell, saw exactly what she had expected: the fracture line forming where love once held. Within weeks, her work bore further fruit. A creditor named Josiah Fletcher arrived from New Orleans, holding notes on Daniel's concealed debts. He demanded payment of $8,000. It was no coincidence. Rachel had sent word south about Daniel's overextension, ensuring the demand would arrive when he could least afford it. To meet it, Daniel sold 20 enslaved people, families torn apart overnight. The auction took place March 28th, under a grey sky, the air thick with dust and disbelief. Margaret watched from the veranda, horror mingling with comprehension. For the first time, she saw Rachel's face unguarded. No sorrow, no pity, only calculation. That night, she confronted her in the hallway. "You did this," she hissed. "All of it. My father's ruin, my brother's shame. You arranged it somehow." Rachel met her gaze without flinching. "Miss Margaret, I am property. Property cannot arrange anything. Your father's decisions made his troubles." "You're a liar. I'll prove it, and when I do, you'll hang." Rachel smiled faintly. "To prove that, you must admit that a slave outwitted you, that your father was ruled by what he owned. Could your pride survive such truth?" Margaret had no answer. She turned away, trembling with a fear that had no place to go. By April, Limestone County murmured of disasters spreading like a fever, 3 great houses, each touched by misfortune, and in each, the same name appearing on purchase records. *Rachel. *Rumor is a form of evidence that needs no courtroom. Men who prided themselves on logic began to speak of curses, of unnatural intelligence, of something that wore obedience like a mask. In his study, Daniel Crenshaw counted and recounted the remnants of his fortune. Every column ended the same. Across the room, Rachel sat quietly, copying figures for him. "You've been most faithful," he said, meaning it. "If only others in this house had your steadiness." She inclined her head. Behind her calm, she thought of the map she had drawn in her mind, the final lines connecting Fairmont, Riverside, and Oak Ridge into one design of ruin. Outside, spring thunder rolled again. To anyone listening, it sounded like weather. To Rachel, it sounded like completion. The rains came early that year, swallowing the dirt roads and isolating plantations in small islands of damp despair. 1,848 inches. Northern Alabama would later be remembered for rot in the cotton, fever in the fields, and rumors in the parlors. But on the morning of April 4th, Daniel Crenshaw believed himself recovering from misfortune. He told neighbors the sale of unnecessary hands had corrected temporary imbalance. He spoke like a man who thought numbers obeyed willpower. Only Rachel understood that what he had sold was not debt, but the last illusion of control. At Oak Ridge, the atmosphere was quieter now, almost reverent with exhaustion. The auction had left the place hollow. Empty cabins stood like teeth pulled from a jaw. Even the crows avoided them. The field hands who remained moved with the care of survivors who understood silence was their only defense. Rachel supervised the accounts, calm as ever. In Daniel's eyes, she had become indispensable, his proof that rational order still existed. He would call her to the study in the evenings, reading figures aloud, asking questions as if they were confessions. She answered each precisely, never offering advice unless invited. Yet every answer nudged him toward a decision that would tighten the rope around his estate. Rachel understood him better than he did himself. His craving for control, his contempt for sentiment, his need to appear logical, even when acting from fear. In May, she noticed Margaret watching her from doorways. The daughter no longer spoke openly, but kept a diary in small, jagged script. Asterisk, she writes in numbers too. Asterisk, Rachel thought, glimpsing the pattern one morning when Margaret left the book on a table, tallies of the days since her brother's exile, lists of debts, hours of prayer. "She is trying to find meaning in arithmetic," Rachel said quietly to herself, closing the cover, like her father. The younger son, Samuel, was different. 19 and restless, he hovered near the barns rather than the study, asking questions the others never dared. "Do you think slavery right, Miss Rachel?" he whispered once when they passed in the hallway. She looked at him steadily, letting the silence stretch until he flushed. "I think it is strong men's idea of order," she said. "And every order, young master, contains its undoing." From that day, he followed her with a mixture of fascination and guilt. Rachel saw the pattern beginning and allowed it to grow another thread to be pulled when the fabric was ready. Meanwhile, Daniel's debts multiplied. The creditors who once called him reliable now delayed correspondence or demanded immediate payment. At first he suspected coincidence. Then, on June 9th, a new visitor arrived, Edmund Fairbanks, a cotton factor from Mobile, with European connections. Fairbanks sought to invest in the county, offering partnerships to reliable planters. Daniel hesitated but saw salvation in the man's capital. When Fairbanks visited Oak Ridge, Rachel served tea. To Daniel she was invisible, to Fairbanks impossible to ignore. He watched her pour the cups with practiced care, her French accent unguarded for the first time in months. Later, when he and Daniel stepped into the garden to smoke, Fairbanks remarked casually, "That woman, she's highly educated for her station." Daniel smiled thinly. An unusual case, but reliable. Reliability is what doomed him. The next day, Rachel requested a word with Fairbanks in private. "Sir," she began, "forgive a servant's intrusion, but I know things about Mr. Crenshaw's accounts you might wish to hear before binding yourself." She spoke with the same poise that had ensnared Samuel Rutland a year earlier. No hysteria, only precision. She revealed the extent of Daniel's borrowing, the fictitious profits entered in his ledgers, and the fact that Fletcher's debt still hung unresolved despite the auction. Fairbanks was shaken. In Mobile, rumors already circulated about the curse of the educated slave. Now he saw evidence in flesh. That evening he declined the partnership, citing unforeseen difficulties. Daniel was humiliated but confused. How had a stranger learned of his private accounts? He never asked Rachel. Some questions risked answers more costly than ignorance. By midsummer, the three families, Rutland, Haverhill, and Crenshaw, stood like collapsing dominoes, each toppling toward the other. In every rumor, the same quiet name repeated, passed among planters like a superstition. Asterisk, Rachel, the literate woman. Asterisk, Haverhill, now desperate and half-mad with debts, went to the county sheriff insisting that Rachel be removed for public safety. The sheriff, Thomas Yarborough, listened, troubled. "You're asking me to arrest property," he said. "Has she stolen, poisoned, struck anyone?" "She destroys families," Haverhill replied. "She uses her tongue like poison." Yarborough spread his hands. "There's no law against intelligence, Mr. Haverhill. If there were, half our clerks would hang." The court refused his petition. The ruling spread through the county like rumor given scripture. Asterisk. A slave cannot be guilty of cunning. Asterisk. To Haverhill, it was insult beyond bearing. To Rachel, it was invitation. In August, he gathered 4 men and planned a private solution. They would seize Rachel from Oak Ridge under cover of night and sell her south, where her history was unknown. Daniel would thank them later, Haverhill reasoned. Order would be restored, but Rachel had been listening. Her network in the quarters caught the whispers before the horses were saddled. When the men arrived on September 14th, the slave cabins were not asleep. They met 20 field hands armed with axes and scythes. The fight was short, fierce, and left 2 intruders bleeding in the dirt. Daniel appeared with a shotgun, demanding to know the cause. When he learned of the attempted abduction, his outrage was genuine. He drove the men off his property and sent for Sheriff Yarborough. By dawn, the story had spread. Haverhill, the county magistrate, charged with attempted theft of another man's slave. The irony was biblical. Haverhill's arrest completed Rachel's design. One man ruined, one shamed, one dependent, yet her triumph carried a new cost. The incident had drawn too much attention. Whispers of witchcraft and unnatural intelligence thickened. For the first time, she felt the structure she'd built tremble under its own weight. The following weeks were uneasy. Field workers avoided her eyes. Daniel's praise became wary. Even Margaret sensed a shift. The mask of loyalty was wearing thin. Rachel knew it was time to end the game. One final act that would seal the fates of all 3 families, and perhaps free her from the pattern she herself had created. That final act would require the youngest Crenshaw. Samuel's affection had deepened into devotion, and devotion, she knew, was the most pliable material of all. One evening in late September, she found him alone by the barns, staring at the horizon. "Do you still wish for a world where people are not bought or sold?" she asked. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Then help me reach it." He did not yet know what she meant, but he would. And when the time came, love like debt, like pride, would prove just another tool in her ledger. The nights at Oak Ridge grew longer as October came on, the damp air heavy with decay from the cotton stalks left after harvest. The fields, stripped and silent, looked like the bones of something exhausted. Within the big house, Daniel Crenshaw's temper moved in the same rhythm, slow, heavy, dangerous. The failed partnership, the public scandal of Havhill's arrest, the debts that refused to vanish all pressed against him like invisible weather. It was in that silence that Samuel and Rachel began to speak more openly. He came to her first out of gratitude she had stopped the abduction, he believed, by warning the others. In truth, she had orchestrated it, letting violence bloom where it would serve her design. Samuel knew nothing of that. To him she was a figure of tragic dignity, a woman wronged yet unbroken. One evening he found her in the library sorting ledgers. "Do you ever wish to be free?" he asked impulsively. She did not answer at once. "Freedom," she said finally, "is a word white men use for themselves. When they speak it for others, they mean control by a gentler name." He stared at her, struck by the calmness of her tone. "Then what do you want?" "To choose," she said, "even if choice leads to ruin." After that, he lingered often. He brought her books, Milton, the Bible, fragments of poetry copied by hand. They read in low voices when the house slept. Rachel, always precise, taught him to listen for the meanings buried under words. "When Eve took the fruit," she said one night, "it wasn't disobedience that frightened Adam, it was understanding. He loved her before he knew he did. And she, who had learned to wield love like a scalpel, allowed it to grow." Daniel noticed his son's distraction. "The boy's grown useless," he muttered to Margaret. "Too much sympathy, not enough sense." Margaret said nothing. She watched, waiting for the inevitable. In late October, Rachel told Samuel that Havhill's allies, men still loyal to him despite his disgrace, were plotting revenge. "They mean to take me before the trial," she said, voice trembling just enough to convince. "They'll kill me to keep me silent." Samuel's heart caught fire. "Then we'll leave," he said. "I'll take you north. There are people who help runaways. I've read about them." Rachel lowered her eyes. "You'd risk prison?" "I'd risk anything." Over the following days, he made plans. He gathered supplies, forged travel papers, and arranged with a sympathetic trader to hide them in a wagon bound for Kentucky. Each night he whispered his progress to Rachel like a child confessing mischief. She listened, encouraging, patient. She had done this before, stoking desperation until it burned bright enough to be seen from miles away. On November 3rd, she decided the time had come. In the hours before dawn, she went to Daniel's study. He sat slumped over his desk, asleep among unpaid bills. She laid before him a packet of letters, Samuel's own hand, foolish and tender, outlining every detail of the escape. When he looked up, she spoke softly. "I found these in the storeroom. I thought you should know before the boy does something rash." Daniel read in silence, his face hardening line by line. "He means to steal my property," he said at last. "He's mad." "He loves her," Rachel replied. The word struck him like a whip. "Love," he repeated, half laugh, half snarl. "Then I'll cure him of it." That evening, when Samuel entered the house carrying the last of their provisions, his father was waiting. The confrontation was merciless. Daniel flung the letters on the table. Samuel denied nothing. He spoke of conscience, of sin, of God's law higher than man's. His father's face turned the color of weathered brick. "You've gone insane," Daniel said, "to think a Crenshaw would beg freedom for a slave." He ordered Samuel confined until arrangements could be made. The next morning, under the pretense of concern for his son's mental condition, Daniel sent him to a private asylum outside Tuscaloosa. The physician's note described delusional attachment to a Negro woman. When the carriage carrying Samuel disappeared down the road, Margaret stood at the window beside her father. "Satisfied?" she asked coldly. "He'll recover," Daniel said, "folly cured by confinement." Rachel, watching from the yard, knew better. Some confinements never end. 3 days later, Daniel called for her. His voice was brittle, his eyes ringed by sleeplessness. "I cannot have you here," he said. "You've brought nothing but trouble, though I know not how. I've arranged your sale to a trader heading south. You'll leave tomorrow." Rachel bowed her head. "As you wish, sir." That night she walked once through the fields, the lantern's light flickering against the wet leaves. The cabins were quiet, but she felt the gaze of those who remembered the families sold in March. When she passed, someone whispered a prayer not for her, but against her. In the morning, chains clicked shut around her wrists. She climbed into the wagon without protest, flanked by 15 others bound for Mississippi. As it pulled away, she turned her head toward the veranda where Daniel and Margaret stood. "Everything I did," she said clearly, "you made necessary." No one answered. For a moment, it seemed the curse was lifted. The house was still, the fields empty. Daniel believed he had restored order, that he had finally cut away the source of contagion. But even as the wagon disappeared into the trees, the damage continued to spread, invisible and irreversible, because Rachel had not merely acted, she had planted. Letters, rumors, debts, and doubts, all moving through the county like seeds on the wind. 2 weeks later, James Havhill's pistol cracked through the stillness at Riverside. His servants found him in the study, head slumped over a letter of accusation, half-written and never sent. By the time the news reached Oak Ridge, Daniel was already trembling under new debts. Margaret, reading the report, whispered, "It's not over." She was right. Rachel was gone in body, but the logic she'd set in motion would finish the work for her, and soon death itself would begin to speak in her defense. The first gunshot shattered the uneasy quiet of Limestone County on November 23rd, 1848. It came from the study at Riverside, echoing over the river before dawn. Neighbors found James Havhill seated upright, a pistol in his left hand, blood on the carpet, and an open ledger beside him. The official verdict, self-inflicted, appeared swift and merciful. It spared the county embarrassment, spared the church a scandal, and spared the legislature from debating whether a magistrate could be ruined by what he owned. But Margaret Havhill, his widow, knew better. The bullet wound was on the wrong side of his head. The note left on the desk, polite, concise, was not in his usual hand. And several papers, those concerning debts and his partnership with Samuel Rutledge, had vanished entirely. She demanded investigation. Sheriff Thomas Yarborough came with his men, examined the scene, and frowned. "No sign of forced entry," he said. "Door locked from inside." "Then how did the documents disappear?" Margaret asked. "Perhaps he burned them." She looked at the cold grate. "Then where is the ash?" Yarborough shifted his weight. He had seen too many respectable families destroyed by gossip. This one would not become another headline. "Ma'am, grief can make a mystery of what isn't one. Take comfort that his sufferings ended." Comfort was impossible. Margaret had lived long enough among planters to recognize the tremor that ran through their voices when they lied to protect themselves. And she had heard the name whispered again in town, like a disease diagnosis no one dared say too loudly. Rachel. Rachel, who had not been seen since the auction wagons left in early November. Rachel, who had lived in every house now in ruin. Margaret sent letters to Huntsville and Mobile, hiring a private investigator named Abraham Cornwall, a former Pinkerton man with a habit of writing too much. She instructed him to follow the pattern. Cornwall arrived in December, bringing a notebook and skepticism. He interviewed servants, examined ledgers, traced transactions. What he found disturbed him profoundly. At each estate, Robichaux in Louisiana, Beaumont in Mobile, Rutledge and Crenshaw in Alabama, he uncovered identical sequences: rising debts, domestic conflict, sudden tragedy, and always the purchase of one literate woman described with unnerving precision. His report, finished on December 22nd, was thick with logic and impotence. Is greater than the woman known as Rachel possesses extraordinary intelligence and a mastery of human behavior. She studies her owners, learns their weaknesses, and sets in motion events that lead to their destruction. Yet, under the statutes of Alabama, she has committed no crime. Her acts are acts of speech, of influence, of suggestion, each legal in isolation, lethal in combination. He delivered the report to Margaret Havhill and to Judge Horace Peaton, the same man who had denied Havhill's earlier petition for Rachel's removal. Reading the document, Peaton muttered, "You are asking me to indict a shadow." Margaret's voice was cold. "A shadow that kills." "Madam," the judge replied, "the law does not recognize mind as weapon, only hand." While they debated, Oak Ridge sank into its own darkness. Daniel Crenshaw's accounts had collapsed completely. The creditor's agents now prowled his fields, assessing what could be seized. Margaret Crenshaw, who had long suspected this end, found her father pacing the yard before dawn, whispering numbers to himself. On January 17th, 1849, his body was discovered in the gin house, crushed beneath the machinery. The coroner ruled it an accident, Yet everyone knew Daniel inspected his equipment only when the gears were still. Witnesses reported a visitor the night before a field hand recently sold away, returned under the pretense of carrying a message from Rachel's new owner. By morning, the man was gone, and Daniel's corpse lay broken. When word reached Margaret Havill, she took the first carriage to Oakridge. Two widowed Margarets, bound by ruin, stood together in the parlor amid the scent of oil and decay. "She's still killing us," Margaret Crenshaw whispered. "No," said the widow, "we're killing ourselves. She only shows us how." They decided then to act jointly, women whose worlds had already ended. They raised what money they could and sent Cornwall westward with one instruction: find her. He tracked Rachel across 3 states, tracing her sale through Mississippi traders who swore she brought good fortune to none. At each plantation she lasted no more than 8 days before being sold again. One trader called her a woman who makes men quarrel. By March, Cornwall reached Texas and found her at the Dalton plantation near the Sabine River. Henry Dalton, a gruff planter with little patience for rumor, agreed to let him interview her. Cornwall entered the cabin expecting defiance, perhaps hysteria. Instead, he found composure. Rachel sat at a plain table, hands folded. She did not rise. "You've followed a ghost," she said. "Now you wish to give it a name." "I wish to know how you destroyed 5 families," he replied. Her eyes flicked toward the window. "They destroyed themselves. I only gave them clarity." For 2 hours she spoke without pause, her voice measured and precise. She described how she identified fear in others, how she mapped relationships, how truth, placed at the right time, could become a blade. "I never lied," she said. "I told them what they already suspected. They supplied the rest." Cornwall, seasoned investigator though he was, felt something close to awe. When he asked why she had done it, she smiled faintly. "Because they bought me," she said, "and I wished to show the cost." When he left, she said one final thing: "Your law made me property. Property cannot sin." Cornwall returned to Alabama with the transcript and a face he could not forget. He presented his findings to Judge Peaton and a special committee of the legislature. The men listened in uneasy silence. Some called for new statutes against sedition and manipulation. Others warned such laws would recognize slaves as rational actors and thus human, a precedent more dangerous than any crime. The debate ended unresolved. The report was filed away, its truth buried under fear. Then, on May 2nd, 1849, another death. Samuel Crenshaw, confined in the asylum near Tuscaloosa, was found hanged in his cell, bed linens knotted around his neck. The doctors spoke of melancholy, others whispered of madness. But Margaret knew. Her brother had loved Rachel. Even chained, she had found a way to reach him through letters, forged or real, through the lingering poison of devotion. By summer's end, 3 families lay in ashes. The Rutledges destitute, the Havils disgraced, the Crenshaws extinct in all but name. The legislature, desperate to restore order, passed the Act of Coercive Influence in 1850, criminalizing psychological manipulation by the enslaved. It was unenforceable, a confession disguised as law. For to punish such a crime, one must first admit the criminal could think. And in that contradiction, the same that Rachel had always understood, the old order began, quietly, to crumble. By the spring of 1849, rumor had replaced history. No official record could explain how 3 families, each prominent, educated, prosperous, had disintegrated within 2 years. Ministers whispered about divine punishment, merchants muttered about women's influence and unnatural cunning. But beneath the gossip, fear grew. If intelligence itself could be weaponized by the enslaved, what protection did birth or law provide? For Margaret Crenshaw, the question became personal obsession. Her father crushed, her brothers gone, her name a shadow. She lived now only to find the woman who had orchestrated their ruin. When word arrived that Rachel had been located in Texas, Margaret sold the last unencumbered tract of Oakridge and boarded a riverboat west, carrying a pistol and the Bible she no longer believed. 3 weeks later, she stepped onto the Dalton plantation. The Texas air was dry, the fields brittle with drought. Henry Dalton met her with suspicion. He had already grown weary of Rachel's presence. "She's clever," he admitted, and cursed. "Men quarrel when she speaks." "She's more than clever," Margaret said. "She's contagion." But Dalton was no fool. He had already sold Rachel to a New Orleans factor named Guam Marchand. "You've missed her by 2 weeks," he said. "Be grateful." Margaret did not stop. She followed the paper trail through Louisiana until she reached the edge of Lake Pontchartrain. There, in a whitewashed house shaded by cypress, she met the widow Elise Delacroix, the remarried wife of Louis Delacroix, one of Rachel's earliest owners. When Margaret introduced herself, Elise regarded her with wary calm. "You've come for the woman," she said. "I expected someone would." "I've come for justice," Margaret answered. "Then you'll need to decide what kind," Elise replied, and sent for Rachel. The door opened, and for the first time Margaret saw her face by daylight. Older, thinner, but with the same steady composure that had haunted her family's name. There was no fear in her eyes, only recognition. "I knew someone would come," Rachel said. "I did not know it would be you." For a long moment the two women stared at each other, enemies bound by the same past. Then Margaret spoke, voice trembling with rage held too long. "You destroyed my father, my brothers, my home. Why?" Rachel sat at the small table, folded her hands, and began to answer, as if giving testimony. "I was born free," she said, "in Richmond. My father was a craftsman, my mother, French. She taught me letters, music, and the folly of believing law and justice are the same. When my father died, his creditors produced papers claiming we were slaves he had harbored unlawfully. I watched men I'd never seen seize our house, our tools, and finally ourselves. My mother died within a year. I was 16 when I learned what property feels like." She paused, voice steady. "For years I tried obedience. It changes nothing. Then I saw what frightened them most: mind. They can chain a body, they cannot chain thought. So I began to use it." Elise sat quietly, hands clasped, as Rachel described her method. Learning families' rhythms, their hungers, their secrets, whispering truths at the precise moment to turn love to suspicion, trust to fear. "I never struck a blow," she said. "They destroyed each other. I only rearranged the mirrors so they could see." Margaret's hands shook. "You call that justice?" "I call it proof," Rachel replied. "Proof that a woman they called property could bring down a world built on her silence." She turned to Elise. "Your husband believed me a servant. He used me to manage his household, to soothe his pride. I showed him his flaws and watched him crumble under them. When he died, you blamed me, not the lies he lived by." Elise's voice was soft. "I did blame you, until I realized he was already dying of a sickness no doctor could name. The sickness was power without mercy." Margaret's fury cracked. "You speak philosophy while graves fill. My father, James Haverhill, Samuel, they were men, not symbols." "And what did they make of me?" Rachel asked quietly. "A possession, a clever pet, a reflection they could own. You call it destruction, I call it recognition." Margaret drew the pistol from her bag, arm trembling. "Then recognize this." Elise stood quickly. "If you shoot her, you'll silence the only witness who can explain what happened." She crossed to a desk and withdrew a bundle of papers, 80 pages bound with string. "She has written everything, not for forgiveness, but for truth. I asked her to write it." Margaret hesitated. "Why?" "Because my husband's ruin made no sense until I heard her speak," Elise said. "I wanted to understand whether vengeance alone drove her or something larger." "And what did you decide?" "That slavery makes monsters of everyone it touches," Elise answered. "Some wield the whip, some wield the mind. She is both victim and weapon." Rachel looked up. "Kill me, and you prove nothing. Let me live, and you prove I cannot be contained. Either way, the world you defend is finished." The pistol lowered slowly. Margaret's rage gave way to exhaustion. She took the manuscript from Elise's hands, the confession written in Rachel's measured script. The pages trembled with the weight of intellect and indictment. "I'll take this to Alabama," she said. "The legislature, the papers, they'll all know what you've done." Rachel nodded. "Then they will also know what they made me." Margaret turned to leave. "I won't kill you," she said, "but I'll make certain no one forgets you." "Good," Rachel whispered. "Forgetting is how power survives." Outside, the air smelled of rain and cypress sap. Margaret walked toward the carriage, clutching the confession as if it burned. Behind her, through the open window, Rachel's voice floated after her, half blessing, half curse. "Remember, Miss Crenshaw, they chained our bodies to protect their world. I used my mind to end it. Which of us was truly free? Margaret did not answer. She only pressed the bundle to her chest and kept walking until the house vanished behind the trees. The war Rachel had begun with words was over, but its echoes, bound in ink and paper, were only beginning. When Margaret Crenshaw returned to Alabama in the summer of 1849, she carried not only Rachel's confession, but a storm compressed into paper. 80 pages of meticulous handwriting, dates, methods, reflections, and accusations, each sentence a knife turned inward against the foundations of Southern society. The journey home was long, and with every mile she read more of the document, alternately weeping and shuddering. What struck her most was not Rachel's hatred, it was her clarity. There were no pleas for pity, no madness disguised as rage, only calm reasoning that a mind denied its freedom will find other forms of expression, and that intelligence, when treated as crime, becomes rebellion by nature. By the time Margaret reached Limestone County, she no longer knew whether she carried evidence of evil or of truth, but she knew it had to be seen. She presented the confession first to Judge Horace Peaton, the same man who had refused to act when Rachel was alive. He read the first few pages in silence, his face hardening, then closed the bundle as though it contained plague. "This document," he said, "cannot be circulated. It gives words to things that should remain unspoken. It gives names to what you refuse to see," Margaret answered. "You called her property. She used the only power property can have possession of its masters." The judge's voice dropped to a whisper. "If you publish this, you will destroy what's left of your family's name." "My name is already Ash," she said. She went next to the state legislature in Montgomery, where lawmakers received her with politeness reserved for troublesome widows. The confession passed hand to hand, read by men who grew paler with each paragraph. Its arguments terrified them, that enslavement created not docile laborers but rational enemies, that a system built on ownership of people would inevitably collapse under its own contradictions, that one woman, armed only with patience and intellect, had demonstrated this truth in bloodless precision. The legislators debated for weeks. Publicly, they condemned Rachel as an agent of moral corruption. Privately, they admitted the danger of acknowledging her genius. To pass judgment on her was to admit her humanity, and to admit her humanity was to indict themselves. In January 1850, they settled on a compromise, a law so vague it was almost satire. Asterisk, the act concerning subversive influence by persons in bondage. Asterisk, it declared that mental or emotional manipulation by enslaved persons upon free citizens was henceforth punishable by death. No one ever invoked it. The act existed only to reassure the frightened. Meanwhile, the confession was quietly archived under seal in the Alabama Department of Records. Margaret was ordered to surrender all copies. She gave them what they asked for and kept one. Years passed. The Rutledges scattered, the Have Hill estate was sold to cover debts, and Oak Ridge decayed under kudzu and rumor. Travelers spoke of a curse, of whispers in the fields. Local papers refused to print the story, though fragments circulated in taverns and churches. She never lifted a weapon, people said, but she killed with thought. Margaret lived in seclusion, tending what little remained of her family's land. Sometimes she opened the surviving manuscript, reading Rachel's words by lamplight. With time, admiration began to mix with hatred. She was monstrous, Margaret wrote in her own journal, but her monstrosity was learned from us. In 1851, Lydia Rutland was discovered living under an assumed name in Ohio, teaching children of freedmen. When asked about Rachel, she refused to speak. "She opened my eyes," was all she said. No record survives of Rachel after 1850. Whether she remained with Elise Delequa, escaped north, or died in obscurity, history gives no answer. Yet her confession endured, traveling quietly through time. During Reconstruction, a copy surfaced in Montgomery. In 1871, weeks before her death, Margaret added a final note to her journal, "Is greater than, I have spent 18 years trying to hate her. It no longer works. I see now that she was not the disease but the diagnosis. She proved that our order was never as solid as we believed. She fought us with the only weapons we allowed her: observation, intelligence, and time, and she won." When Margaret died, her papers were boxed and forgotten in the courthouse attic. Almost a century later, in 1964, A historian cataloguing antebellum estates opened one of those boxes and found Rachel's manuscript, brittle but legible. Scholars debated its authenticity. Some called it a masterpiece of early slave resistance literature. Others dismissed it as an elaborate forgery. The truth, like Rachel herself, remained elusive. One passage, however, transcended debate. It appeared quoted in journals, textbooks, even sermons, is greater than, I could have killed them in their sleep, and they would have called me savage. Instead, I killed their certainty, and they called me impossible. I prefer impossible. By the 1970 seconds, the original confession was sealed again, deemed too controversial for public display. But copies had already circulated among historians who recognized its magnitude. In university lectures, Rachel was compared to Machiavelli, to Olympe de Gouges, to the nameless rebels who understood systems best because they suffered under them. Her legacy lingered not as myth but as mirror. For every generation that rediscovered her words, the question returned, was Rachel villain, visionary, or inevitability? The answer changed with the era. In times of comfort, she was condemned as devil. In times of unrest, she was hailed as prophet. And perhaps that was her final victory, that the mind once sold as property could still command the attention of centuries. Today, in the archives of Montgomery, the clerk's note beside the sealed folder reads simply, Rachel, confession, restricted access, contain dangerous idea. Even in silence, she still had the last word. More than 100 years after Rachel vanished from the historical record, her name still whispered through the rural counties of northern Alabama like an echo that refused burial. Teachers spoke of her cautiously in segregated classrooms. Preachers mentioned her only to warn their flocks that evil can wear a calm face. Yet even in condemnation, they gave her immortality. In 1967, a graduate researcher at Tuskegee University named Patricia Lanier obtained special permission to examine the restricted materials of the Alabama Department of Archives. What she uncovered reignited debate across academic circles. Rachel's original confession, its final pages, yellowed, ink fading, but legible. Lanier described her discovery in a private letter to her advisor, is greater than, the manuscript is not the work of an illiterate servant or even a common housekeeper. It reads like a treatise, half personal testimony, half philosophical essay on power. Her tone is surgical, not sentimental. She saw through the structure of her world, the way an engineer sees through stone to the hidden load-bearing weaknesses, and she dismantled them one by one. The letter was never meant for publication, but it circulated anyway, igniting both outrage and fascination. Newspapers called Rachel the Southern Medea, the Phantom of Limestone County, America's first psychological rebel. Churches denounced her as satanic. Universities invited Lanier to lecture on enslaved intellect as resistance. Through all the noise, one line from Rachel's confession began to appear on protest placards and in civil rights speeches. Is greater than, they can chain our hands, but they cannot chain thought. In the streets of Montgomery, that sentence took on new life, transformed from defiance, whispered in bondage, to anthem shouted in freedom. The more historians studied her, the less certain they became of what, exactly, Rachel had been. To some, she was a calculated avenger, cold and cruel, who turned intellect into retribution. To others, she was the inevitable result of a society that demanded obedience but taught its captives to observe. Her destruction of the planter families, they argued, was not vengeance, it was demonstration. She proved the hypocrisy of a system that worshipped reason while denying it to those it enslaved. The Alabama legislature, uncomfortable with renewed attention, quietly reaffirmed the restricted status of her confession in 1973. Officially, this was to preserve the fragile paper. Unofficially, it was to keep her voice from speaking too loudly again. But by then, it was too late. Excerpts had appeared in journals, in novels, even in plays that reimagined her life. Each retelling blurred the boundary between woman and myth. One literary scholar summarized her story with chilling precision. As greater than, Rachel fought with ideas, and that made her more dangerous than any insurrection. Violence can be punished, intelligence must be denied. Yet in denying it, the slaveholders confirmed everything she claimed. And so the circle closed. What began in secrecy on the plantations of Limestone County ended as a symbol discussed in universities around the world. A woman once defined as property now studied as philosopher, strategist, and ghost. Even today, the official archives still carry the same label on the sealed box that holds her writings. *** Rachel. Confession access restricted, contains dangerous ideas. ***. It is perhaps the most honest description in all of American history. Because Rachel's story is not merely about vengeance or justice, it is about knowledge itself and the terror it inspires in those who mistake power for wisdom. She understood before any of them did that empires fall not from rebellion, but from comprehension, that once the enslaved can explain the logic of their chains, those chains begin to dissolve. Her war required no armies, no weapons, no armies, only awareness. And awareness, once awakened, cannot be enslaved. If you've stayed with this story until now, you've glimpsed why time's legacy of fear times exists to remember what history tried to forget. Rachel's story reminds us that power built on silence will always fear the mind that speaks. So what do you think? Was she villain or visionary, a destroyer of lives, or a messenger of truths her world refused to hear? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, the stories that unsettle, comfort, and challenge history, then share this video, subscribe, and ring the bell. Because the most dangerous stories are the ones that were never supposed to be remembered.